The coffee cup shattered against the diner floors. The armed robber's hand went limp. Through the front window, 347 yards away, a muzzle flash disappeared into the Nevada desert darkness. Inside Murphy's all-night diner, customers cowered behind overturned tables, unaware that their salvation had come from the small woman in a stained apron who'd been serving them pie just moments before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In 8 seconds, Madison Hayes would do something that would shatter every assumption her co-workers had made about the quiet waitress who worked the graveyard shift. The hands that had been trembling while pouring coffee would steady with surgical precision. The eyes that seemed to dart nervously around the room would calculate wind speed, humidity, and target movement with deadly accuracy. And the woman they called Jumpy would prove why some of the most dangerous predators choose to hide among the sheep. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's all-night diner cast harsh shadows across the checkered linoleum floor, creating a checkerboard of light and darkness that seemed fitting for a place where nothing was quite what it appeared. Located on Highway 95, 30 miles outside Las Vegas, the diner served as a way station for truckers, late-night gamblers, and the kind of people who preferred to travel when the world wasn't watching. Madison Hayes moved between the red vinyl booths with the practiced efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of being invisible. At 31, she stood barely 5'3" in her non-slip shoes, with shoulder-length auburn hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform, a powder blue dress with white trim that had seen better decades, hung loose on her slight frame, making her appear even smaller than she was. The name tag pinned crookedly to her chest read Madison in faded black letters, but most customers never bothered to look that closely. Her movements were economical, almost mechanical as she refilled coffee cups and cleared plates with the sort of mindless repetition that came from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. But those who paid attention, and few did, might have noticed peculiarities that didn't quite fit the narrative of a small-town waitress grinding through another lonely shift. The way she positioned herself at each table provided clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. How she could identify the make and model of vehicles before their headlights fully illuminated the parking lot. Most tellingly, the woman never truly relaxed, maintaining a state of alertness that belonged in war zones rather than greasy spoons. Her hands told their own story to anyone trained to read such things. Calluses in specific locations that had nothing to do with carrying plates or handling coffee pots. Small scars along her knuckles that suggested combat training rather than kitchen accidents. And a slight tremor in her left hand that became more pronounced during busy periods, not from nerves or caffeine, but from old nerve damage that should have ended more than just a waitressing career. "Madison, table 6 needs more coffee and the truckers in booth 4 are getting impatient." The voice belonged to Margie Patterson, the night manager whose authority derived more from volume than competence. At 45, Margie had never worked anywhere but Murphy's, and her worldview had been shaped by 20 years of dealing with the kinds of people who ate at diners at 3 a.m. Margie's assessment of Madison was simple and dismissive, useful but unremarkable. A woman clearly running from something, probably an abusive relationship or financial troubles, who was grateful enough for steady work to accept below minimum wages and irregular hours. The perfect employee for a business that operated in the margins of respectable society. She's reliable, I'll give her that. Shows up on time, doesn't complain about the hours, keeps her head down. Nervous as a cat in a thunderstorm, but harmless enough. Probably never been in a fight in her life. The assessment couldn't have been more wrong. But Madison had worked carefully to cultivate exactly that impression. Every gesture, every response, every interaction had been calculated to reinforce the image of someone forgettable and fragile. It was a performance she'd been perfecting for 3 years, ever since the day she'd walked into Murphy's with a hastily constructed background and references that would check out under casual scrutiny but wouldn't survive serious investigation. The diner's other employees had accepted her story without question. Tommy Brennan, the cook whose culinary skills peaked at not quite inedible, saw her as confirmation of his own superiority. At 28, he possessed the kind of casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of small disappointments and smaller achievements. "Look at Jumpy over there," said Tommy, using the nickname that had stuck after Elena's first week when her hypervigilance had been misunderstood as anxiety. Probably thinks the coffee machine's gonna bite her. Good thing she's got this job, 'cause she sure as hell couldn't handle anything that required actual backbone. His mockery was particularly rich, coming from someone who had called in sick the one time the diner had been robbed during the day shift, claiming a sudden case of food poisoning that coincidentally lasted exactly as long as the police investigation. Crystal Williams, the part-time waitress who worked weekends, was more sympathetic but equally dismissive. At 22, she still believed that confidence was something you either had or you didn't, and Elena clearly fell into the latter category. "I feel bad for her sometimes," she confided to the other staff. "She's obviously been through something terrible, probably why she ended up here. But she's so fragile. Like if someone raised their voice too loud, she'd just break into pieces."
The irony was lost on all of them. Elena's apparent fragility was actually hyper-awareness, the product of training that had cost the U.S. government millions of dollars and enemies of the state their lives. Her nervous glances weren't signs of fear, but tactical assessments. Her tendency to startle at sudden sounds came from years of operations where the difference between a footstep and a threat could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Every night, Elena arrived at Murphy's at 10 p.m. sharp, parking her beat-up Honda Civic in the same spot at the far end of the lot, a position that provided multiple escape routes and clear observation of approaching vehicles. She carried herself with the hunched shoulders and quick, nervous steps of someone trying to remain invisible, but her chosen parking spot revealed strategic thinking that belonged to someone with extensive tactical training. Her apartment, a studio above the town's only pawn shop, was as carefully constructed as her public persona. Sparse furnishings that could be abandoned at a moment's notice, no photographs or personal items that might reveal her true identity. Even her clothing seemed chosen to reinforce the image of someone barely scraping by, though the boots she wore to work were far higher quality than anyone noticed. Military issue, broken in by thousands of miles in hostile territory. The official story Madison had crafted was simple and believable. Divorced, no family, drifted to Nevada after a bad breakup. She claimed to have worked at various restaurants across the Southwest, providing references that would check out because she'd created them herself using skills learned in a different life. The woman behind the counter at Murphy's was Madison Hayes, former waitress from Phoenix, running from a violent ex-husband and grateful for steady work in a place where nobody asked too many questions. The truth was considerably more complex. Madison Hayes didn't exist until 3 years ago. Before that, she had been Staff Sergeant Madison Clark, callsign Ghost, the deadliest sniper in Delta Force history. Her military records, if they could be found, would show 73 confirmed kills across 4 deployments, a record that made her legendary, even among special operations communities that specialized in impossible missions and extraordinary soldiers. But those records had been buried under layers of classification that made them effectively invisible. Operation Sandstorm, her final mission, had gone so catastrophically wrong that the Pentagon had decided it was easier to erase everyone involved than to explain what had happened in the mountains of Afghanistan. Ghost had officially died in that classified operation, along with her entire unit. Madison Hayes had been born from the ashes of that bureaucratic decision, a carefully constructed identity designed to keep a dangerous woman safely hidden from enemies who might still be looking for revenge. The transition from elite warrior to small-town waitress hadn't been easy. Years of training that emphasized constant vigilance and split-second decision-making didn't translate well to the mundane rhythms of civilian life. Madison had to consciously suppress instincts that had kept her alive in some of the world's most dangerous places. She had to learn to walk without automatically scanning for threats, to interact with people without calculating how quickly she could neutralize them if necessary. The tremor in her left hand was a constant reminder of the price she'd paid for her survival. nerve damage from torture endured during 6 weeks of captivity after Operation Sandstorm had gone wrong. The enemy had captured her unit during what should have been a routine extraction, and Elena had spent 42 days in a cell that existed in no official records, enduring interrogation techniques designed to break even the strongest minds. She'd escaped, eventually, through a combination of patience, planning, and lethal skill that had left 12 guards dead and a compound in flames. But by the time she'd made it back to friendly territory, the political situation had changed. The operation she'd been a part of was now an embarrassment that threatened careers in international relations. The easiest solution was to declare everyone involved KIA and start fresh with a new team and a new mission profile. Madison had been given a choice: accept a new identity and a comfortable pension, or face court-martial for an operation that never officially existed. The choice was simple, even if the adjustment wasn't. Now, 3 years later, she moved through Murphy's all-night diner with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that sometimes the best way to hide was in plain sight. Her coworkers saw what she wanted them to see: a broken woman grateful for steady work and too damaged to cause trouble. They had no idea that the nervous waitress who jumped at loud noises could put 3 rounds in a target the size of a quarter from half a mile away. The night that would change everything began like any other. Madison clocked in at 10 p.m. sharp, tied her apron with movements that appeared routine but actually followed a specific sequence that ensured quick removal if necessary. She checked the coffee levels, wiped down tables that were already clean, and positioned herself behind the counter where she could observe the entire dining area and parking lot simultaneously. At 10:30, the dinner rush would begin. Truckers stopping for late meals, casino workers getting off shift, and the usual collection of insomniacs and night dwellers who populated places like Murphy's during the dark hours. Madison would serve them with the same nervous efficiency she'd shown for 3 years, invisible and forgettable.
But tonight would be different. Tonight, circumstances would force Madison Hayes to remember that she had once been Ghost, and that some skills were too deeply ingrained to ever truly disappear. The woman who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being invisible was about to discover that sometimes survival meant stepping back into the light. The first sign of trouble came at 11:47 p.m., when Madison noticed the black Suburban that had been circling the parking lot for the past 10 minutes. Her trained eyes identified details that her civilian coworkers missed entirely: tinted windows that exceeded legal limits, license plates that were too clean for a vehicle traveling desert highways, and an occupancy pattern that suggested multiple passengers despite the apparent emptiness of the vehicle. Madison continued serving coffee and clearing tables, but her posture had shifted subtly. The nervous energy that her coworkers mistook for anxiety was actually combat readiness. Every muscle in her body was prepared for action, even as she maintained the facade of the timid waitress who wouldn't hurt a fly. In the kitchen, Tommy Brennan was regaling Crystal with another story about Madison's supposed cowardice, unaware that the woman he was mocking was currently calculating shooting angles and escape routes with the precision of someone who had turned such calculations into an art form. The Suburban finally parked, and 3 men emerged. They moved with the casual confidence of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation and violence. Madison's assessment was immediate and professional. Gang members, probably, based on their coordinated movements and the bulges in their jackets that suggested concealed weapons. They were here for money, most likely, seeing the isolated diner as an easy target. What they didn't know was that they had just walked into the hunting ground of one of the most dangerous predators the U.S. military had ever produced. Madison Hayes might have been a nervous waitress, but Ghost had never truly died. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to remind the world why some legends were born from truth rather than fiction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Have you ever been completely wrong about someone? Maybe you dismissed a coworker as weak, only to discover they had survived something that would have broken most people. Or perhaps you underestimated a quiet neighbor who turned out to be hiding extraordinary skills. Share your story in the comments below.
These moments of revelation fascinate me, and they're exactly why I'm drawn to stories like Madison's. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who've learned that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. If Madison's journey resonates with you, that like button helps me bring more of these hidden stories to light. Your support means I can continue uncovering the truth about forgotten heroes who walk among us, invisible until the moment they choose to step forward. Now, let's dive deeper into the world where nobody suspected that the woman serving their midnight coffee had once been the military's most feared ghost. The late-night crowd at Murphy's All-Night Diner represented a cross-section of Nevada's forgotten people. Truckers hauling cargo across endless desert highways, their CB radios crackling with lonely chatter. Casino dealers and cocktail waitresses heading home after shifts spent watching other people's dreams crumble at blackjack tables and slot machines. Construction workers from the solar farms sprouting across the desert like technological flowers in an electronic garden. To all of them, Madison Hayes was part of the scenery, as familiar and unremarkable as the cracked vinyl booths and the coffee machine that wheezed with every brew cycle. She existed in their peripheral vision, refilling cups and clearing tables with the kind of mechanical efficiency that made her effectively invisible. But invisibility was exactly what Madison had cultivated, and tonight it would serve her well. At Booth 7, Jake Martinez nursed his third cup of coffee while studying load manifests on his tablet. The long-haul trucker had been coming to Murphy's for 2 years, usually stopping around midnight on his Phoenix to Reno runs. In all that time, his interactions with Madison had been limited to orders and small talk about weather and road conditions. "She's sweet enough," Jake would tell other drivers when Murphy's came up in CB conversations. "Quiet as a church mouse, though. Probably been through some rough times, you know. Women don't end up working graveyard shifts at desert diners because everything went according to plan." His assessment was kinder than most, but it still missed the mark entirely. Jake saw Madison's hypervigilance as nervousness, her tactical positioning as coincidence, her economical movements as timidity. Like everyone else, he had no idea that the woman who seemed startled by the coffee machine's sudden hissing had once moved through Taliban strongholds like a shadow, eliminating high-value targets with shots that defied physics and probability. At the counter, retired construction foreman Bill Thompson sat hunched over a plate of eggs and hash browns that had long since grown cold. At 67, Bill had worked on projects across 3 states and had developed strong opinions about people based on what he considered a lifetime of accurate character assessment. That waitress girl, he'd told his drinking buddies at the local VFW, wouldn't last 5 minutes on a real job site. Too jumpy, too soft, probably never done a day of hard work in her life. These young women today, they got no backbone, no real grit.
The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so profound. Bill had spent 40 years pouring concrete and raising steel frames, honest work that had earned him respect and a comfortable retirement. But his idea of hard work and real grit couldn't have prepared him for the reality of what Madison had endured during her military service. 6 weeks of torture that would have broken most people in 6 hours. Missions that required her to remain motionless for days at a time, waiting for the perfect shot while enemy patrols passed within arm's reach. Tommy Brennan's mockery had evolved over the 3 years Madison had worked at Murphy's, becoming more elaborate and cruel as her failure to respond emboldened him. Tonight, as he scraped the grill with unnecessary violence, he was particularly animated in his assessment of the woman he'd nicknamed Jumpy. "I swear she about jumped out of her skin when that semi backfired in the parking lot earlier," he told Crystal, who was counting tips at the register. "Probably thought it was gunfire or something, like anyone would waste bullets on a place like this." Crystal giggled, though with less malice than Tommy's commentary deserved. At 22, she hadn't yet learned that cruelty often masqueraded as humor, or that the quiet people were frequently the ones with the most interesting stories. "Maybe she was in an accident or something," Crystal offered, attempting what passed for compassion in their limited social circle. "Like maybe she was in a car wreck and has PTSD about loud noises." "PTSD," Tommy snorted, slapping a burger patty onto the grill with excessive force. "Probably the most dangerous thing she's ever faced was a difficult customer asking for their order modified. I bet she's never even seen real violence, much less been through anything that would give her actual trauma. The conversation continued as Madison moved through the dining area, apparently absorbed in her routine tasks, but actually listening to every word. Her gray eyes tracked the speakers without seeming to focus on them, a skill developed through years of gathering intelligence while maintaining operational cover. Tommy's assessment was particularly galling, not because it hurt her feelings. Madison had endured far worse than kitchen gossip, but because it demonstrated how completely she had succeeded in her deception. The man mocking her for supposed cowardice had no idea he was standing 15 feet away from someone who had killed more enemy combatants than most infantry units saw in entire deployments. The tragic irony was that Tommy's own military experience consisted of 4 months in basic training before being discharged for what his records diplomatically termed failure to adapt to military lifestyle. In civilian terms, he'd washed out because he couldn't handle the physical demands and psychological pressure of even the most basic military training. Yet here he was mocking a woman who had excelled in programs that eliminated 90% of applicants before they even reached operational status. Margie Patterson's management style relied heavily on what she considered motivational criticism, although anyone with actual leadership experience would have recognized it as barely disguised bullying. Her treatment of Madison was typical of how she handled employees she perceived as weak or vulnerable. "Madison, table 3 has been waiting for their check for 10 minutes, Margie announced loud enough for the entire diner to hear, despite the fact that Madison had delivered the check 8 minutes ago and the customers were still leisurely finishing their dessert. "I know you're trying your best, but we need to stay on top of things." The public correction was designed to establish hierarchy and demonstrate Margie's authority to other staff and customers. What she didn't understand was that Madison's apparent acceptance of such treatment was actually tactical patience, the same quality that had allowed her to wait 17 hours in a sniper hide for a single shot that eliminated a terrorist cell leader. Madison simply nodded and moved to check on table 3, where the customers were indeed still working on their pie. Her response was perfectly calibrated to reinforce her image as someone who accepted criticism without complaint, too damaged or desperate to risk her job by standing up for herself. But beneath the surface, Madison's mind was cataloging details that her civilian co-workers missed entirely. The way Margie's voice carried traces of the alcohol she'd been consuming in the office. How Tommy's increasing agitation correlated with text messages he'd been receiving throughout the evening. Crystal's nervous energy that suggested she was hiding something more significant than her usual minor workplace infractions. These observations weren't paranoia or hypervigilance. They were the automatic threat assessment protocols that had kept Madison alive through 4 combat deployments. In hostile territory, survival depended on reading people accurately, understanding their motivations, and predicting their actions before they became dangerous. The diner's late-night regulars had their own theories about Madison's background, most of them constructed from the kind of casual prejudice that passed for insight in small-town America. They saw a woman working a menial job and assumed failure. They noticed her nervous mannerisms and concluded weakness. They observed her isolation and decided she was antisocial or damaged. None of them considered that her job choice might be strategic rather than desperate, that her nervous behavior might be the result of training that emphasized constant awareness rather than psychological trauma. Frank Morrison, a regular who worked security at one of the nearby casinos, considered himself an expert on reading people. His job involved identifying threats and suspicious behavior among casino patrons, and he developed considerable confidence in his ability to assess character.
"That waitress is running from something," he'd told his wife during one of their weekend conversations about the interesting people he encountered during his work week. "Probably got involved with the wrong guy, maybe owes money to dangerous people. Women like that, they end up in places like Murphy's because they're trying to disappear." His assessment was simultaneously completely wrong and accidentally perceptive. Madison was indeed trying to disappear, but not from an abusive relationship or gambling debts. She was hiding from enemies of the state who would kill her if they discovered that Ghost was still alive. Her cover identity wasn't protection from domestic violence, it was national security. The most tragic aspect of the mockery Madison endured wasn't its cruelty, but its blindness. Her co-workers were standing next to someone who had accomplished things they couldn't imagine, survived experiences that would have destroyed them, and developed skills that placed her among the most elite soldiers in American military history. Tommy Brennan's jokes about Madison's supposed cowardice were particularly ironic, given that she had volunteered for missions that 99% of soldiers would have refused. His mockery of her nervous behavior ignored the fact that her hyper-awareness had saved not just her own life, but the lives of countless American servicemen and women who never knew they'd been protected by Ghost's rifle. Crystal's sympathetic but condescending attitude toward Madison's perceived fragility missed the reality that this fragile woman had endured torture that would have broken most people, escaped from a fortified compound through a combination of patience and lethal skill, and adapted to civilian life despite psychological scars that would have justified a lifetime of disability payments. Even Margie's dismissive treatment of Madison as a desperate woman grateful for any job failed to recognize that her employee was actually a decorated veteran who had chosen invisibility over recognition, anonymity over acclaim. But the most profound irony was that Madison's greatest military virtue, her ability to remain invisible until the moment action was required, was now being mistaken for her greatest civilian weakness. The same qualities that had made her legendary in special operations circles made her appear unremarkable in civilian settings. As the clock moved past midnight and the diner settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet conversation and clinking dishes, none of Madison's coworkers suspected that their assumptions were about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. The black Suburban in the parking lot represented more than just another late-night customer vehicle. It represented the moment when Madison Hayes would have to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed cover and protecting the innocent people who had spent 3 years mocking her weakness, never suspecting they were working alongside one of the most dangerous human beings the American military had ever produced. The stage was set for a revelation that would transform not just how her coworkers saw Madison, but how they understood the nature of true strength itself. The first crack in Madison's carefully constructed facade had appeared 6 months earlier during what everyone assumed was just another routine night at Murphy's. A drunk trucker named Ray Sullivan had gotten handsy with Crystal, grabbing her wrist when she tried to clear his table and making comments that crossed every line of workplace decency. What happened next lasted exactly 4 seconds, but those who witnessed it would remember the details for years afterward. Madison had been wiping down tables at the far end of the diner when Sullivan's behavior escalated. Most people wouldn't have even noticed the incident from that distance, especially with the ambient noise of conversation and kitchen sounds. But Madison's head had snapped up immediately, her gray eyes locking onto the situation with laser focus. She crossed the distance between her position and Sullivan's booth in a way that seemed impossibly fast, yet somehow didn't look like running. Her movement was fluid, economical, like water flowing around obstacles. Before anyone fully registered what was happening, Madison was standing beside Sullivan's table. "Sir, I think you should let go of my coworker now," she had said in her usual soft, musical voice. But there was something underneath the politeness, a quality that made Sullivan's alcohol-fogged brain register danger on a primal level. He'd released Crystal's wrist immediately, though he couldn't have articulated why. Later, when telling the story to other truckers at the next truck stop, Sullivan would claim he'd just been being a gentleman and responding to a polite request, but those who had been watching closely noticed details that didn't match that narrative. Madison's positioning had been perfect, close enough to intervene instantly, but at an angle that gave her leverage and mobility.
Her hands, which normally showed that slight tremor, had been rock steady. Most tellingly, something in her expression had changed. The nervous, submissive waitress had been replaced for just a moment by someone who looked entirely capable of handling a 250-pound drunk trucker if he chose not to comply. Tommy Brennan had witnessed the entire exchange from the kitchen pass-through window, but his interpretation was predictably shallow. Jumpy got lucky that trucker was too drunk to cause real trouble. If Sullivan had wanted to press the issue, she would have folded like a house of cards. What Tommy missed, what everyone missed, was the way Madison had assessed Sullivan's condition and capabilities in those first few seconds. Her positioning wasn't accidental, it had been tactical. She'd identified his dominant hand, noted his reduced reaction time due to alcohol consumption, and positioned herself to neutralize any potential threat while maintaining the appearance of merely being a concerned coworker.
The incident had passed without further drama, but it left behind questions that nobody quite knew how to ask. Why had Madison responded so quickly to a situation she shouldn't have been able to see clearly from her position? How had she covered that distance so efficiently? And what exactly had Sullivan seen in her eyes that made him back down so immediately? Similar anomalies had accumulated over Madison's 3 years at Murphy's, creating a pattern that was invisible to casual observation, but troubling to anyone who bothered to connect the dots. There was the night when a kitchen fire had started in the deep fryer, flames leaping toward the ceiling while Tommy panicked and Crystal screamed. Madison had appeared with a fire extinguisher before anyone had even thought to look for one, deploying it with the practiced efficiency of someone who dealt with similar emergencies before. Her movements had been sure and professional: aim at the base of the flames, use controlled bursts, ensure complete coverage before declaring the area safe. "Where did you learn to handle a fire extinguisher like that?" Margie had asked afterward, more curious than suspicious. Madison's answer had been typically evasive. "My dad was really big on safety, made sure I knew how to handle emergencies." The explanation was plausible enough that nobody questioned it, but it didn't account for the military precision of her response, or the fact that she'd located the extinguisher in less than 5 seconds, despite it being stored in a maintenance closet she supposedly never accessed. Then there was the medical emergency that had occurred during Madison's 2nd month at the diner. An elderly customer named Herbert Walsh had suffered what appeared to be a heart attack, clutching his chest and collapsing beside his booth. While other staff members stood frozen or ran around frantically looking for someone who knew first aid, Madison had responded with immediate, decisive action. Her assessment of Walsh's condition had been rapid and professional. She'd checked his pulse and breathing, positioned him correctly, and begun CPR with textbook form. But more than just her technical skill, it was her demeanor that had been revealing. While everyone else was panicking, Madison was calm, focused, working through established protocols with the kind of muscle memory that suggested extensive training. When the paramedics arrived, their lead EMT had watched Madison's technique for several seconds before taking over. "Nice work," he'd told her quietly. "You've definitely done this before. Are you in the medical field?" Madison had deflected the question with her usual skill. "I took a CPR class at the community center a few years ago. Just tried to remember what they taught us." But the EMT's expression had suggested he recognized something more than basic community center training in her responses. Herbert Walsh had survived, and his family had sent flowers to the diner with a card thanking the angel waitress who saved Papa's life. Madison had accepted their gratitude with appropriate humility, but several staff members noticed that she'd seemed almost uncomfortable with the recognition. The most telling incident had occurred just 2 months ago, involving a piece of equipment that had nothing to do with waitressing or basic civilian skills. A Nevada Highway Patrol officer named Janet Rodriguez had stopped by Murphy's during a routine patrol, parking her cruiser in the lot while she grabbed coffee and checked reports. When she'd returned to her vehicle, Rodriguez had discovered that her patrol rifle had somehow become misaligned in its dashboard mount, throwing off the weapon's zero. It was the kind of problem that usually required a trip to the department armorer, since the rifle's precision was critical for public safety operations. Madison had been cleaning tables nearby when she'd overheard Rodriguez talking to Margie about the problem. Without thinking, she'd spoken up. "The mount screws probably loosened from road vibration. If you can access the adjustment tools, it's a pretty straightforward alignment. Just need to compensate for the scope height and confirm your bore sight." The words had left her mouth before she'd realized how they would sound. Rodriguez had turned to stare at the small waitress who just demonstrated knowledge of precision rifle mechanics that most civilian gun enthusiasts would never acquire. "How exactly do you know about scope alignment?" Rodriguez had asked, her law enforcement instincts pinging on the anomaly. Madison's recovery was smooth, but not entirely convincing. "My ex-husband was really into hunting, long-range stuff. I picked up some things watching him work on his rifles." The explanation was plausible enough that nobody questioned it, but it didn't account for the technical precision of her language or the confidence with which she diagnosed the problem. Rodriguez had accepted the explanation at face value, but she'd made a mental note about the incident. Later, when discussing it with her partner, she'd admitted to feeling like there was more to the story. That waitress knew way too much about rifle mechanics for someone who just watched her husband tinker with hunting rifles. The way she talked about bore sighting and scope height, that's not casual knowledge. These incidents, individually, could be explained away as coincidence or the random accumulation of knowledge that people gathered throughout their lives. But taken together, they painted a picture of someone whose skills and experience extended far beyond the boundaries of civilian restaurant work. Madison's physical capabilities had also drawn occasional notice, although usually in ways that reinforced rather than challenged her cover identity. Her small stature and apparent frailty made her seem harmless, but careful observers might have noticed inconsistencies in her physical presentation.
Most tellingly, Madison's startle responses were all wrong for someone with anxiety issues. While she appeared to jump at sudden noises, her physical reactions suggested tactical awareness rather than genuine fear. She would orient toward potential threats, assess situations rapidly, and return to baseline alertness faster than someone genuinely suffering from anxiety disorders. Dr. Patricia Kim, a psychiatrist who occasionally stopped at Murphy's after late hospital shifts, had noticed Madison's unusual response patterns during several visits. As someone trained to recognize genuine trauma responses, Kim had found Madison's behavior intriguing rather than concerning. "That waitress has hypervigilance symptoms," Kim had mentioned to her colleague during a professional conversation about PTSD presentations. "But it's not typical anxiety-based hypervigilance. It's more like tactical awareness, like she's scanning for threats rather than just being generally anxious." The observation had been astute, but Kim had attributed it to Madison's supposed history of domestic violence rather than military training. The explanation fit the available narrative and didn't require deeper investigation. Perhaps most revealing were Madison's unconscious habits, the small behaviors that emerged when she thought nobody was watching, the way she automatically tested the structural integrity of chairs before sitting down, how she positioned herself in any room to maintain visual contact with all entrances. Her tendency to notice and remember details about customers that had no relevance to serving food or taking orders. She knew which regulars carried weapons, though she'd never seen them armed. She could identify law enforcement officers in civilian clothes before they'd said a word.
She tracked vehicle movements in the parking lot with an attention to detail that belonged in surveillance operations rather than customer service. Bill Thompson, the retired construction foreman, had actually noticed some of Madison's more obvious tactical behaviors, though he'd misinterpreted their significance. "That girl's paranoid as hell," he'd told his drinking buddies, "always sitting where she can see the doors, always watching the parking lot like she's expecting trouble. Probably why she ended up in this situation, too nervous and jumpy to hold down a real job." The irony was profound. Bill was observing genuine tactical awareness developed through years of high-stakes operations, but he was interpreting it as weakness rather than strength. Madison's apparent paranoia was actually professional-grade situational awareness, the kind of skill that kept special operations personnel alive in hostile environments. As the black Suburban continued its slow circuits of Murphy's all-night diner, these accumulated anomalies were about to be resolved in a way that would transform everyone's understanding of the nervous waitress who'd been serving their coffee for 3 years. The woman they dismissed as jumpy and fragile was about to remind them that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who'd learned to hide their claws until absolutely necessary. The 3 men who emerged from the black Suburban moved with the coordinated precision of a pack that had hunted together before. Their leader, a tall man with prison tattoos crawling up his neck, surveyed Murphy's all-night diner with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating both opportunity and resistance. Behind him, his companions, one stocky with scarred knuckles, the other lean and twitchy with the hollow-eyed look of a meth user, flanked him in a formation that spoke of practiced violence. Madison's assessment was immediate and comprehensive. Primary threat: the leader, approximately 6'2", 220 pounds. Dominant right hand evidenced by weapon placement, moves with confidence, suggesting leadership experience in criminal organization. Secondary threat: the stocky one, boxer's build. Defensive positioning indicates he's the muscle, probably carries backup weapons. Tertiary threat: the addict, unpredictable due to chemical influence, most likely to escalate situations beyond rational control. Her hands continued their routine motions, wiping down the counter, organizing condiment bottles, but every movement was now calculated to maintain operational readiness. The tremor in her left hand had vanished completely, replaced by the rock-steady control that had once made her legendary among Delta Force snipers. "Evening, folks," the leader said as the trio entered, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone accustomed to getting compliance through intimidation. Tommy Brennan looked up from his grill, irritation replacing his usual boredom. He'd been dealing with difficult customers for years and had developed what he considered an effective approach to managing troublemakers. "Kitchen closes in 10 minutes, so if you want food, you better order fast." It was exactly the wrong response to give armed criminals who had come here for something other than midnight snacks. The leader's smile widened, but the expression never reached his eyes. "Oh, I don't think we'll be needing any food, friend. We're here for something a little more, substantial." Crystal Williams felt the first flutter of genuine fear as the atmosphere in the diner shifted palpably. Her experience with difficult customers had been limited to drunk truckers and demanding tourists, not men who radiated the kind of menace that made her survival instinct scream warnings she didn't yet understand. Madison moved slightly behind the counter, ostensibly organizing supplies, but actually positioning herself with access to multiple tactical advantages. Her gray eyes tracked each intruder's position, noting weapon placement, movement patterns, and the micro-expressions that would telegraph their intentions moments before they acted. "Margie," she called softly toward the manager's office, her voice carrying just enough urgency to convey seriousness without triggering panic. "Could you come out here for a moment?" The request seemed routine to everyone, except for Madison, who was actually implementing crisis management protocols she'd learned in hostage rescue training. Get the authority figure engaged, establish communication channels, and begin subtle evacuation procedures for non-combatants.
Margie Patterson emerged from her office with the annoyed expression of someone whose administrative duties had been interrupted by staff incompetence. She took one look at the three men and immediately understood that this was beyond her experience managing drunk customers and payroll disputes. "Gentlemen, how can we help you tonight?" she asked, her voice betraying only slightly the fear that was beginning to crystallize in her chest. The leader stepped forward, his hand moving casually toward his jacket in a gesture that was both threat and promise. "Well, ma'am, we heard this little establishment does pretty good business. Truckers with cash, casino workers with tips, folks who prefer to keep their transactions private. Seems like the kind of place that might have accumulated some serious money over the years." The robbery announcement hung in the air for a moment before the implications fully registered with the diner's occupants. Jake Martinez, the trucker who'd been peacefully reviewing his logbooks at Booth 7, felt his throat go dry as he realized his late-night coffee stop had just become a life-threatening situation. Bill Thompson, the retired construction foreman who'd spent years working around dangerous equipment and volatile personalities, found himself facing a type of danger he'd never encountered. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his wallet, already calculating how much cash he was carrying and whether cooperation would ensure survival. "Now, we can do this easy, or we can do this hard," the leader continued, his voice remaining conversational despite the menace underlying every word. "Easy means everybody stays calm, nobody tries to be a hero, and everyone goes home tonight with nothing worse than a good story to tell. Hard means, well, let's just say hard isn't what you want." Madison's mind was processing threat assessments and tactical options with mechanical precision. 3 armed hostiles, approximately 15 non-combatants, including staff and customers, limited cover, multiple civilian vulnerability points, standard hostage situation with robbery motivation, likelihood of violence increases with resistance or unexpected complications. But her official response was perfectly in character. "Please, just take whatever you want. We don't want any trouble." Her voice carried exactly the right amount of fear to reinforce her image as a terrified civilian while actually buying time to complete her tactical assessment. The stocky man positioned himself near the front entrance, blocking the primary exit route while maintaining visual contact with his companions. His movement was professional, not the random positioning of a street thug, but the deliberate placement of someone with training in crowd control and tactical operations. The meth user took position near the kitchen, his twitchy energy making him the wild card in an already volatile situation. His pupils were dilated, his movements erratic, creating the kind of unpredictability that made hostage situations exponentially more dangerous. "Smart girl," the leader said, nodding approvingly at Madison's apparent submission. "See, folks, that's how we handle business like civilized people. Now I'm going to need everyone to move to those booths over there, nice and slow, hands where we can see them." As the customers and staff began complying with the gunmen's orders, Madison found herself facing the most complex tactical challenge of her civilian life. Every instinct developed through years of special operations training was screaming at her to neutralize the threats immediately. She had the skills, the positioning, and the element of surprise necessary to end this situation before anyone got hurt. But she also had a cover identity to maintain and civilians to protect. Any action she took would expose abilities that contradicted everything her coworkers believed about her. More critically, she had no backup, no extraction plan, and no way to ensure civilian safety if the situation escalated beyond her ability to control it. The leader approached the register, his weapon now visible as he made his demands clear. "Open it up, sweetheart. Let's see how much Murphy's all-night diner has been squirreling away for a rainy day." Margie's hands shook as she attempted to operate the cash register, her fingers fumbling with keys she'd used thousands of times before. The stress of armed robbery was interfering with basic motor functions, creating the kind of delays that could trigger violence from impatient criminals. "Come on, lady," the meth user called from his position near the kitchen, his voice carrying the edge of chemical-induced paranoia. His pupils were dilated, his movements erratic, creating the kind of unpredictability that made hostage situations exponentially more dangerous. Madison recognized the escalation pattern immediately. The addict was becoming agitated, his chemical condition making him prone to irrational decisions that could transform a simple robbery into a massacre. She had perhaps 60 seconds before the situation spiraled beyond peaceful resolution. That's when she noticed something that changed everything. The leader's tactical vest, partially visible beneath his jacket, bore markings that she recognized from her military service. These weren't ordinary criminals looking for easy money. The equipment, the coordination, the professional positioning, this was a team with advanced training and specific objectives that went beyond simple robbery. Her mind raced through the implications. If these men were connected to her past, if they'd somehow discovered that Madison Hayes was actually Madison Clark, then everyone in the diner was in mortal danger. Her cover identity wasn't just personal protection, it was national security, and its compromise could have consequences that extended far beyond Murphy's all-night diner.
Tommy Brennan, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis of courage and stupidity. His years of mocking Madison's supposed cowardice had built up a self-image as someone who would handle real danger better than the jumpy waitress who worked beside him. Now, faced with actual armed criminals, he was discovering the difference between kitchen bravado and genuine courage. "You guys picked the wrong place," Tommy announced, his voice cracking with false confidence. "We got security measures you don't know about. Cameras, silent alarms, the works. Cops are probably already on their way." It was exactly the wrong thing to say to armed criminals who were already operating on a tight timeline. The leader's expression hardened, his weapon swinging toward Tommy with lethal intent. Madison realized that her carefully maintained cover was about to become irrelevant. Tommy's misguided attempt at heroism was going to get everyone killed unless she acted immediately. The choice between maintaining her false identity and protecting innocent lives wasn't really a choice at all. The woman they called Jumpy was about to remind the world that some legends never truly died. They just waited for the right moment to return from the shadows where they'd been hiding. The moment Tommy Brennan's bravado triggered the leader's weapon toward lethal intent, something fundamental shifted in Madison Hayes. The carefully constructed mask of nervous submission didn't fall away dramatically, it simply ceased to exist, replaced by something that had been waiting 3 years to emerge. Her movement was so fluid that most observers would later struggle to describe exactly what they'd witnessed. One second she was the trembling waitress cowering behind the counter, the next she was a different person entirely. The transformation wasn't visual as much as it was energetic, a change in presence that made the air itself feel dangerous. The salt shaker on the counter became a projectile with surgical precision. Madison's throw caught the leader in the temple with enough force to disrupt his aim without causing permanent damage, a calculated strike that demonstrated restraint even in the midst of lethal action. His weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as he staggered, more shocked than injured. But it was what happened next that truly revealed who Madison Hayes had once been. The stocky man near the entrance reacted with trained efficiency, his weapon clearing leather in a practiced draw that spoke of professional instruction. Madison was already moving before his barrel aligned with any target, her body flowing through space in ways that defied the physical limitations everyone had assumed defined her. She vaulted the counter with gymnastic fluidity, landing in a tactical crouch that positioned her behind the coffee machine while maintaining clear firing lanes to all 3 threats. Her hands, which had trembled while pouring coffee just minutes earlier, were now rock steady as they found the concealed weapon she'd kept hidden beneath the register for 3 years. The Sig Sauer P320 had been carefully maintained despite never being fired in civilian life. Madison's muscle memory was absolute as she acquired her first target, the stocky man whose professional training made him the most immediately dangerous threat to civilian lives.
Her shot was perfection incarnate, center mass, controlled pair, textbook execution that dropped him before he could fully process that the nervous waitress had just become the most dangerous person in the room. The sound of the shots was almost anticlimactic, professional, efficient, final. Crystal Williams screamed, a sound of pure terror that encapsulated everyone's shock at witnessing Madison's transformation. The woman who'd served them coffee with shaking hands had just eliminated an armed threat with the cold precision of a machine built for killing. The meth user near the kitchen responded with chemical-fueled rage, his weapon spraying bullets in Madison's general direction with the kind of undisciplined fire that endangered everyone in the diner. Madison's response was a masterclass in tactical patience. She waited for his magazine to empty, counting rounds with the automatic precision of someone who'd done this calculation under fire countless times before. When the click of an empty chamber echoed through the diner, Madison emerged from cover like death itself had taken human form. Her movement toward the meth user was economical, purposeful, terrifying in its efficiency. She didn't run, she flowed, closing distance with the kind of predatory grace that apex predators used when their prey had exhausted all options for escape. The disarming technique she employed was textbook special operations. Control the weapon, neutralize the threat, minimize collateral damage, maintain tactical awareness of remaining hostiles. The meth user's arm broke with an audible snap as Madison redirected his strike into a joint lock that physics made inescapable. His weapon clattered across the floor, sliding to rest beneath Booth 4, where Jake Martinez lay frozen in shock. "Stay down," Madison commanded, her voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The musical quality was still there, but underneath it was something that made every person in the diner understand that compliance wasn't a request, it was the difference between life and death. The leader had recovered from the salt shaker impact, but his assessment of the situation had undergone radical revision. The nervous waitress was gone, replaced by someone whose movements and tactical awareness marked her as elite military. His radio crackled with urgent communication from team members positioned outside the diner, voices tight with professional concern as the operation deviated from its carefully planned parameters. "Ghost," he said quietly, the call sign carrying 3 years of intelligence gathering and patient hunting. Madison's gray eyes locked onto his with the kind of focus that made lesser people look away involuntarily. "Then you should have looked harder, because Ghost died in Afghanistan. I'm just a waitress who's having a very bad night."
But even as she spoke, her positioning and awareness remained absolutely tactical. She maintained cover behind the overturned table that provided ballistic protection while keeping clear sight lines to the entrance and kitchen. Her weapon remained ready, though not directly threatening, the stance of someone confident enough in their abilities to avoid appearing overtly aggressive. The leader smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "We know about Operation Sandstorm. We know what really happened in those mountains. We know the Pentagon couldn't admit their intelligence failures, so they buried everyone involved rather than face congressional inquiries." Madison's left hand, the one that normally trembled from nerve damage, clenched into a fist so tight that her knuckles went white. The mention of Operation Sandstorm brought back memories she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. Teammates tortured to death, intelligence compromised by political calculations, survival purchased with the blood of people who'd trusted their government to bring them home. "Who sent you?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "People who remember what Ghost cost them," the leader replied. "People who've spent 3 years tracking down everyone who survived that clusterfuck in the mountains. You're the last name on a very short list." The implications hit Madison like physical blows. If these people had been systematically hunting Operation Sandstorm survivors, then she wasn't just fighting for her own life or the lives of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. She was fighting to protect national security secrets that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger active personnel still in the field. Tommy Brennan, meanwhile, was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown as he witnessed the transformation of the woman he'd spent 3 years mocking. The jumpy waitress who couldn't handle loud noises just eliminated 2 armed professionals with the kind of lethal efficiency that belonged in military training videos. "What the hell are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ringing in everyone's ears from the gunfire. Madison's response was delivered without taking her eyes off the remaining threat. "I'm someone who's very tired of being underestimated." Margie Patterson had retreated behind the register, her worldview shattered by witnessing capabilities that contradicted everything she thought she knew about human nature. The woman she'd dismissed as desperate and damaged had just demonstrated skills that suggested training worth millions of dollars and operational experience in the world's most dangerous places. But it was Jake Martinez who verbalized what everyone was thinking. "Jesus Christ, lady, where did you learn to do that?" Madison's answer carried the weight of memories she'd never shared with anyone. Places that don't exist, doing things that never happened for people who were never there. The cryptic response only deepened the mystery, but the leader understood its significance perfectly. Ghost's operational history was classified beyond top secret, buried in files that required presidential authorization to access. Her missions had taken place in countries the United States wasn't officially operating in, targeting people whose deaths couldn't be acknowledged without diplomatic catastrophe. "The thing is, Ghost," the leader continued, his weapon trained on Madison, but held with the cautious respect of someone who just witnessed her eliminate 2 team members. "We're here because you have something that belongs to us. Information you took when you escaped that compound in Afghanistan." Madison's expression didn't change, but those observing closely might have noticed a slight tightening around her eyes. The intelligence she'd gathered during her 6 weeks of captivity had indeed been valuable. Valuable enough to justify her torture, valuable enough to compromise national security if it fell into the wrong hands. "I gave everything to my debriefers, though they both knew it was a lie. Not everything. Not the names, not the locations, not the operational details that could shut down networks we've spent decades building." The standoff had evolved beyond simple robbery into something that touched the darkest corners of international espionage and covert operations. Madison realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to end, regardless of how this situation resolved itself. But first, she had to keep the innocent people around her alive long enough to matter. The radio on the leader's belt crackled with urgent communications that Madison's trained ear decoded immediately. "Alpha 1, shots fired, civilian screaming detected. Perimeter teams report law enforcement response vehicles approximately 8 minutes out. Request immediate extraction or mission abort." Madison's tactical assessment updated instantly. Multiple hostiles outside, limited time before law enforcement arrival, classified intelligence at stake, civilians in immediate danger. The equation was complex, but her conclusion was simple. Neutralize all threats before anyone else could get hurt. "Your backup teams are about to have a very bad night," Madison said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd survived far worse odds in places where backup was measured in days rather than minutes. The leader's expression tightened. "You think you can handle 6 more operators? Even Ghost wasn't that good." Madison's smile was colder than the Nevada desert at midnight. "Ghost was never just one person. We were a unit. But I was the one they called when the unit needed someone eliminated from impossible distances under impossible conditions."
As if summoned by her words, the diner's front window exploded inward as a sniper's bullet from the parking lot sought to eliminate what the outside team now recognized as an extraordinary threat. The shot was professional, well aimed, but Madison was already moving before the muzzle flash had faded. Her combat role took her behind the industrial coffee machine, while glass shards rained down on the positions where terrified civilians were huddled. The outside sniper had made a critical error. He'd assumed Madison would remain stationary, like a normal person under fire. Instead, she'd anticipated the shot based on tactical positioning and timing. "Everyone stay down," Madison commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with military authority. "Crawl toward the kitchen, stay below window level, and don't stand up until I tell you it's safe." Crystal Williams, her face streaked with tears and her hands shaking uncontrollably, looked up at Madison with a mixture of terror and awe. "What's happening? Who are these people? Who are you?" Madison's response came while she was field stripping her weapon to check for damage from the glass explosion, a process that took her exactly 12 seconds despite the ongoing gunfire. "I'm someone who made a promise a long time ago that I'd never let innocent people die because of my past. Tonight, I'm keeping that promise." The leader used the distraction of the sniper fire to reposition himself, but Madison tracked his movement with peripheral vision while maintaining primary focus on the external threats. Her spatial awareness was absolute. Every person's location, every potential cover position, every tactical advantage mapped in real time. "Tommy," she called to the cook who was hyperventilating behind the grill, "there's a fire axe in the utility closet. Get it? Then help move people toward the walk-in freezer. It's the most ballistically secure location in the building." Tommy stared at her with a glazed expression of someone whose reality had been fundamentally altered. "How do you know about ballistic security? How do you know any of this?" Madison's answer came while she was calculating angles for her next movement. "Because I spent 8 years learning how to kill people in buildings exactly like this one, and another 6 months being tortured by people who wanted me to forget everything I'd learned." The casual revelation sent shockwaves through everyone within hearing. Margie Patterson felt her legs give out as she realized the woman she'd been condescendingly managing for 3 years was describing experiences that belonged in classified military documentaries rather than civilian restaurants. Outside, the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly for the assault team. They'd expected to find a hiding government witness, not a fully operational Special Forces soldier who'd been laying low while maintaining combat readiness. Their communications reflected growing desperation as professional confidence gave way to survival instinct. Madison monitored their radio chatter through the leader's device, her comprehension of tactical terminology allowing her to track their positioning and intentions in real time. "Your friends are repositioning for a frontal assault," she informed the leader, whose weapon remained trained on her despite his team's obvious disadvantage. "They're going to breach through the front and back simultaneously, probably with flashbangs to disorient everyone before engaging." The leader's expression confirmed her assessment. "You've got maybe 2 minutes before this place becomes a war zone. Give us what we want, and the civilians don't have to die in the crossfire." Madison's laugh carried no humor whatsoever. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. I don't negotiate with terrorists, foreign or domestic. I eliminate them." What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones among law enforcement and military communities for years afterward. Madison Hayes, the nervous waitress who jumped at loud noises, demonstrated why Delta Force snipers were considered the most lethal individual weapons in the American military arsenal. Her movement toward the diner's rear exit was a tactical masterpiece. She used overturned tables for cover, civilian positions as concealment, and the leader's hesitation to engage her in close quarters as an opportunity to establish superior positioning. Every step was calculated to minimize civilian exposure while maximizing her tactical advantages. The backdoor explosive breach came exactly when Madison predicted it would. 2 operators in full tactical gear burst through the smoking entrance, weapons raised, expecting to find cowering civilians and their target pinned down by superior firepower. Instead, they found Madison Hayes waiting for them, with the patience of a spider and the lethality of a viper. Her first shot took out the lead operator's night vision equipment without harming him, a demonstration of precision that communicated her capabilities while maintaining her rules of engagement. The second shot disabled the backup operator's weapon with surgical accuracy that turned military-grade hardware into expensive paperworks. "Gentlemen," Madison announced in her musical voice, though the tone now carried undertones that made trained killers reassess their life choices. "You have 30 seconds to withdraw before I stop being polite about this situation." The remaining operators had spent their careers hunting high-value targets across multiple conflict zones, but they'd never encountered someone who treated their coordinated assault like a minor inconvenience. Their tactical communications devolved into something approaching panic as they realized their target possessed capabilities that exceeded their mission parameters. "Alpha teams, abort immediate. Repeat, abort immediate. Target is not a witness protection case. Target is active military with combat capabilities beyond assessment protocols." But Madison's attention had shifted to a more immediate concern. Jake Martinez, the trucker who'd been quietly trying to help other civilians reach safety, had taken shrapnel from the explosive breach. His left leg was bleeding steadily, and his face was going pale in a way that suggested arterial involvement. Without hesitation, Madison transitioned from combat operator to battlefield medic. Her movements toward Jake were tactical but purposeful, designed to provide medical assistance while maintaining defensive positioning.
"Apply pressure here," she told Crystal, guiding the younger woman's hands to the proper position on Jake's wound. "Keep talking to him. Keep him conscious. I need to finish dealing with these people before I can give him proper medical attention." The ease with which Madison shifted between lethal combat and life-saving medicine demonstrated a level of training that belonged to the most elite military units. Her ability to compartmentalize allowed her to provide medical guidance while simultaneously tracking multiple hostile contacts and coordinating civilian protection. Bill Thompson, who'd spent months mocking Madison's supposed weakness, found his voice in a moment of profound realization. "You're not just a soldier, are you? You're something special, something they don't tell regular people about." Madison's response came while she was checking ammunition levels and assessing her tactical situation. "I was part of a unit that officially never existed, conducting operations that never happened, in places where we were never deployed. When things went wrong, it was easier for everyone involved to pretend we'd never been there at all." The leader, meanwhile, had been making his own calculations. His team was compromised, law enforcement was approaching, and his target had just demonstrated capabilities that transformed a simple extraction into a military engagement his people weren't equipped to handle. "This isn't over, Ghost," he said, activating a device that Madison recognized as a tactical smoke grenade. "We know where you are now. We know who you've become. Running won't work anymore." As smoke filled the diner, Madison made a decision that would change everything about her carefully constructed civilian life. The woman who'd spent 3 years hiding from her past was about to step fully back into the light, consequences be damned. The tactical smoke grenade transformed Murphy's all-night diner into a gray maze where visibility dropped to arm's length and every shadow could conceal death. But while the assault team had hoped the smoke would level the playing field, they'd made a critical miscalculation. Madison Hayes had spent years operating in conditions where darkness was an ally rather than an obstacle. Her movement through the smoke-filled diner was poetry written in violence. Years of training in low-visibility environments had taught her to navigate by sound, air currents, and spatial memory. She could hear the leader's breathing patterns shift as he tried to track her position, could sense the minute air displacement that indicated someone moving past the overturned booth where Crystal was still applying pressure to Jake's wound. "Stay exactly where you are," Madison whispered to the civilians, her voice somehow carrying clearly through the chaos despite being barely audible.
I'm going to end this, but I need you to trust me and not move until I tell you it's safe." Tommy Brennan, crouched behind the industrial dishwasher with tears streaming down his face, finally understood the profound stupidity of the mockery he'd subjected Madison to for 3 years. The woman he'd called Jumpy was moving through tactical smoke with the confidence of someone who'd done this before in places where the stakes were measured in national security rather than robbery proceeds. "How is she doing this?" he whispered to no one in particular. "How does she know where everyone is?" The answer was training that cost the U.S. government approximately $2.3 million per operator. But Tommy would never know those specifics. What he was witnessing was the practical application of skills developed in the most advanced military training facilities in the world, refined through deployments in environments where a single mistake meant death not just for the operator, but for entire missions. Madison's enhanced spatial awareness allowed her to construct a 3-dimensional map of the smoke-filled diner using only audio cues and memory. She knew the remaining assault team members were attempting to establish crossfire positions, their tactical training evident in their methodical approach to clearing a compromised environment. But their training was conventional military, designed for standard urban warfare scenarios. Madison's training had been specialized for situations where conventional approaches would fail catastrophically. She'd learned to hunt in environments where her targets possessed every advantage except the one that mattered most. They didn't know she was coming. The first tactical team member made contact sooner than Madison had anticipated, emerging from the smoke near the coffee station with his weapon raised and ready. His night vision equipment gave him a significant advantage in the reduced visibility, but Madison had been tracking his approach for 30 seconds before their encounter became inevitable. His response was a masterclass in close-quarters combat adapted for civilian environments. Instead of the lethal techniques that would have been her first choice in military operations, she employed non-lethal methods designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing the risk to nearby civilians. The disarming technique was so fluid that the operative's weapon was in Madison's hands before his nervous system had fully processed the attack. Her follow-up strikes targeted nerve clusters that would incapacitate without causing permanent injury. The kind of precision that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy combined with perfect muscle control under extreme stress. "Sleep tight," Madison murmured, as the operative collapsed, alive but completely unconscious. Her voice retained that musical quality, but now it carried undertones that belonged to someone comfortable with violence as a professional tool rather than an emotional release. The second tactical team member had heard his colleague's brief struggle and was approaching with the cautious advance of someone who understood they no longer hunted a target. They were being hunted by something significantly more dangerous than their intelligence had suggested. Madison used his caution against him, employing a technique she'd learned from studying predator behavior in nature documentaries during her recovery from Operation Sandstorm. She remained absolutely motionless until he passed her position, then struck from behind with the kind of surgical precision that rendered resistance impossible.
"Two down," she announced quietly, though her words were intended for the leader rather than her civilian co-workers. "How many more people do you want me to embarrass before you accept that this operation is blown?" The leader's response came from somewhere near the front entrance, his voice tight with the kind of professional frustration that came from watching a carefully planned mission dissolve into tactical disaster. "You can't protect all of them, Ghost. Even you're not that good." Madison's laugh was soft but carried clearly through the dissipating smoke. "You'd be surprised what I can do when people I care about are threatened. The Pentagon learned that lesson in Afghanistan. Tonight, you get to learn it in Nevada." What the leader didn't know, what no one except Madison's former Delta Force teammates had known,
was that her legendary sniper capabilities were only part of what made her dangerous. Her true specialty was what military doctrine termed protective interdiction, the ability to eliminate multiple threats while ensuring zero civilian casualties in complex urban environments. The training had been experimental, designed to create operators who could function as one-person protective details for high-value civilians in hostile territory. Madison had been the program's most successful graduate, capable of neutralizing entire terrorist cells while protecting diplomats who never knew they'd been in danger. Now she was applying those skills to protect a diner full of people who'd spent 3 years treating her like a broken bird, grateful for scraps of employment. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it also didn't matter. Her oath to protect innocent lives didn't include exceptions for people who'd failed to recognize her capabilities. As the tactical smoke continued clearing, the true extent of Madison's transformation became visible to the civilians who'd been hiding in terror. The woman who'd served their coffee was now moving with predatory grace, her eyes tracking threats with mechanical precision, her entire demeanor radiating lethal competence. Margie Patterson found her voice in a moment of profound realization. 3 years! 3 years you worked here and we never knew! How did we never know? Madison's response came while she was zip-tying the unconscious operatives with improvised restraints made from dish rag strips. Because I needed you not to know. Because sometimes the best way to disappear is to become so ordinary that people look right through you. Bill Thompson, whose assessment of Madison's character had been catastrophically wrong, struggled to reconcile what he was witnessing with his lifetime of assumptions about strength and weakness. You let us treat you like you were nobody special. Why? Why didn't you ever say anything? Madison's answer revealed depths of sacrifice that none of them had considered. Because the moment I acknowledged what I was, people would have started asking questions. Questions about where I'd been, what I'd done, who I'd killed. Questions that would have endangered not just me, but active operations and personnel still in the field. The leader had been listening to this exchange while calculating his remaining options. His team was neutralized, law enforcement was approaching, and his target had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded his mission parameters by several orders of magnitude. But retreat wasn't an option. The intelligence Madison possessed was too valuable to abandon. "You think this ends here?" he called out, his voice carrying the desperation of someone whose professional reputation was disintegrating in real time. "You think you can go back to serving coffee and pretending to be normal after tonight?" Madison's response was delivered while she was performing advanced first aid on Jake Martinez, whose condition had stabilized but still required professional medical attention. Normal was never an option for me. I've just been borrowing it for 3 years. The sound of approaching sirens was growing louder, creating a time constraint that would force resolution of the standoff within minutes. Madison knew that law enforcement's arrival would create complications that could endanger the civilian she'd been protecting, but it would also provide the backup she needed to ensure everyone's safety. "Crystal," she said to the young waitress who'd been following her medical instructions with surprising competence, "when the police arrive, tell them there's one remaining hostile near the front entrance. Tell them the civilians are secure, but there's one injury requiring immediate medical attention." Crystal nodded, though her expression suggested she was still processing the reality that her coworker was someone whose existence belonged in classified government files rather than small-town diners. The leader made his final decision as the first law enforcement vehicle turned into Murphy's parking lot, emergency lights painting the desert night in red and blue strobes. If he couldn't extract Madison or the intelligence she possessed, he could at least ensure that her cover identity was permanently destroyed. "Say goodbye to Madison Hayes," he announced, raising his weapon in a final desperate gambit that would force her to reveal her full capabilities to law enforcement personnel who would ask questions she couldn't answer without compromising national security. But Madison was already moving,
her response demonstrating why Delta Force snipers were considered the most lethal individual weapons in the American military arsenal. Her final action of the night would prove that some legends were too dangerous to ever truly retire. The leader's weapon never found its target. Madison's response was so swift, so precisely executed, that witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they'd seen. One moment he was raising his weapon in a final desperate attempt to force a lethal confrontation. The next moment he was on the ground, unconscious, his weapon skittering across the diner floor, while Madison stood over him with the calm expression of someone who just completed a routine task. The technique she'd used was called a neural disruption strike in Delta Force training manuals, a non-lethal method of incapacitation that targeted specific pressure points to induce immediate unconsciousness without causing permanent injury. It was the kind of skill that required thousands of hours of practice and perfect understanding of human anatomy, developed specifically for situations where lethal force would create more problems than it solved. "Clear," Madison announced, using military terminology that carried absolute authority despite her soft voice. "All threats neutralized, all civilians secure." The first law enforcement officers through the door were Nevada Highway Patrol, responding to the shots fired call with the kind of tactical readiness that came from years of dealing with desert highway violence. What they found was a scene that would generate reports requiring classification levels beyond their security clearance. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the same highway patrol officer whose rifle Madison had helped realign months earlier, entered with his weapon drawn and his training focused on threat assessment. What he discovered was 6 unconscious suspects zip-tied with improvised restraints, 1 wounded civilian receiving expert medical care, and the nervous waitress he remembered from previous visits standing calmly in the center of controlled chaos. "Ma'am, are you injured?" Rodriguez asked, his professional demeanor intact despite the obvious confusion about what had transpired in Murphy's all-night diner. Madison's response was carefully calibrated to provide necessary information while avoiding details that would require classified briefings she couldn't afford. "I'm fine, officer. These men attempted to rob the diner and threaten the customers. I was able to subdue them before anyone was seriously hurt." The understatement was so profound that it bordered on comedy, but Rodriguez had enough tactical experience to recognize when someone was deliberately minimizing their involvement in a situation that clearly required extraordinary capabilities to resolve successfully. "Ma'am, with respect, subduing 6 armed suspects isn't something most civilians can accomplish. Do you have military or law enforcement background?" Madison's pause was almost imperceptible, but to trained observers it represented a moment of calculation about how much truth she could reveal without compromising operational security that extended far beyond her personal situation. "I have some training," she said finally, the words carrying enough weight to suggest significant understatement while avoiding specifics that would trigger investigations she couldn't afford. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen arrived 20 minutes later, her Air Force intelligence credentials clearing her through the law enforcement perimeter with the kind of efficiency that suggested phone calls had been made at classification levels requiring presidential authorization. Her presence at a small-town diner robbery scene would have been inexplicable to civilian observers, but Madison understood immediately that her cover identity had been permanently compromised. "Staff Sergeant Clark," Chen said quietly, using Madison's real military name for the first time in 3 years. "We need to talk." The civilians who'd been Madison's co-workers and customers for 3 years listened to this exchange with the growing realization that they'd been living alongside someone whose existence operated in dimensions they'd never imagined. The woman they'd known as Madison Hayes, the nervous waitress who jumped at loud noises, was actually someone important enough to warrant personal attention from military intelligence officers. Tommy Brennan found the courage to approach Madison as paramedics were loading Jake Martinez into an ambulance. His face was streaked with tears, and his voice cracked with the weight of 3 years of cruelty toward someone who could have ended his mockery at any moment, but had chosen restraint instead. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. All those things I said, all those times I called you, I didn't know. I couldn't have known, but that doesn't make it right." Madison's response revealed the depth of character that had made her legendary among special operations personnel. "You were working with the information you had. I made sure that information was incomplete. The fault was mine for needing to deceive you, not yours for believing the deception." The absolution was more than Tommy deserved, but it was exactly what someone who dedicated her life to protecting others would offer. Her capacity for forgiveness was as extraordinary as her capacity for violence, representing the complete psychological profile that allowed certain individuals to function as guardians of civilization's most vulnerable moments. Crystal Williams approached next, her young face showing the kind of awe that came from witnessing capabilities that belonged in movies rather than real life. "Are you really going to be okay? I mean, after tonight, can you still be normal?" Madison's smile was sadder than her tears would have been. "Normal was borrowed time. I always knew it would end eventually. The only question was whether it would end with me choosing to leave or circumstances forcing me out." Margie Patterson's approach was more hesitant, her authority as night manager revealed as meaningless in the context of Madison's true capabilities. "I don't know what to say. 3 years I managed you, and I never saw. How do you go back to being a waitress after being whatever you really are?" Madison's answer carried the weight of decision she'd been avoiding for months. "I don't think I can. Tonight changed everything for everyone here, including me." Lieutenant Colonel Chen's debriefing was conducted in the back booth where Madison had served countless cups of coffee to customers who never suspected they were being protected by one of America's most elite warriors. The conversation was classified at levels that would require congressional notification, but the essential elements were straightforward. "Your cover is blown," Chen said without preamble. "The assault team tonight was connected to networks that have been hunting Operation Sandstorm survivors for 3 years. They've confirmed your location and capabilities. Staying here would endanger everyone you've been trying to protect." Madison nodded, having reached the same conclusion the moment the leader had spoken her call sign. "What are my options?"
Chen's response carried the weight of national security decisions made at classification levels beyond Madison's security clearance. "We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe that requires someone with your specific skill set. The mission parameters match your operational preferences. Protect high-value civilians in hostile territory while eliminating threats that conventional forces can't address." The offer represented a return to the life Madison had tried to leave behind, but it also offered something her civilian identity never could: the opportunity to use her extraordinary capabilities for their intended purpose, rather than hiding them behind coffee service and forced smiles. "What about them?" Madison asked, indicating her former co-workers who were being interviewed by various law enforcement agencies. "They'll be briefed on operational security requirements and monitored to ensure their safety. Your presence here put them at risk, but your departure will eliminate that threat permanently." As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Madison Hayes prepared to cease existing. The woman who'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to disappear again, but this time into missions that would utilize rather than suppress her legendary capabilities.
Her final conversation was with Jake Martinez, who'd been stabilized and was awaiting transport to a Las Vegas trauma center. His leg would heal completely, but his understanding of human nature had been permanently altered by witnessing what people were capable of when circumstances demanded extraordinary responses. "Thank you," he said simply, "for saving my life, for protecting everyone here, for being better than any of us deserved." Madison's response was characteristic of someone who dedicated her life to service without expectation of recognition. You would have done the same thing if you'd had the training. Protecting innocent people isn't heroism, it's basic human decency. As she walked away from Murphy's all-night diner for the last time, Madison Hayes ceased to exist. In her place, someone new emerged, not the nervous waitress who'd hidden among civilians, but not quite the legendary ghost who'd terrified enemies across multiple conflict zones. She was something new, a guardian who'd learned that true strength sometimes meant appearing weak, that real courage often looked like cowardice, and that the most dangerous people were frequently the ones who chose to hide their capabilities until someone threatened the innocent. The desert sunrise painted the sky in colors that matched the transformation of everyone who'd witnessed the night's events. They would never again look at quiet people and assume weakness. They would never again mistake restraint for inability. And somewhere in the files that required presidential authorization to access, a new mission folder was being created for an operator whose cover identity had been burned, but whose capabilities remained undiminished. Ghost was back, and the world's most dangerous places were about to be reminded why some legends never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to return from the shadows where they've been patiently protecting people who never knew they needed protection. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.